And a hush falls over the crowd. We're good. Excellent. Happy Halloween Eve, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in our PACCAR IMAX Theater here at Pacific Science Center for our Science in the City talk. By being here tonight, you're not only celebrating the spooky season, but also supporting science education in your community. Dr. Caitlin Casimo is our featured speaker this evening. Caitlin brings a unique blend of scientific knowledge and theatrical flair. With a background combining neuroscience and performing arts, Caitlin uses her skills in science communication to make complex topics from the bleeding edge of research, bleeding edge, thank you very much, accessible and engaging for all learners. She currently leads the Education and Engagement Program at the Allen Institute, which supports programs and resources for scientists, educators, and students to learn how to use the Allen Institute's open data and tools. Tonight, Caitlin is taking us on a fascinating journey through the vascular system of the brain. We're going to explore the intricate network of blood vessels that nourish this vital organ and learn why it's so susceptible to blood flow interruptions. So whether you are a seasoned scientist or a curious vampire, get ready to be captivated by the wonders of neuroscience. Now, I am pleased to say that in addition to all of you live here in the room with us tonight, we do have people that are watching through our live stream as well. If you are part of our live stream audience, welcome. And during the Q&A, everybody watching on YouTube can still participate by adding your questions to the YouTube chat box, and then we will be asking those questions live here in the room. If you don't see a YouTube chat box, you just need to make a quick YouTube account to be able to see that chat box and add your questions. Everybody here in the room, all you have to do for the Q&A portion later on is just raise your hand. Thank you so much for being here today. Caitlin, thank you for being here today. We're ready for our brain journey.
Well, thank you for having me back for my 9th time here at Pacific Science Center. And thank you all for joining me tonight for The Ethical Vampire, considering the human circulatory system's functions and its limitations. I am Dr. Caitlin Casimo, and while I am not a vampire, many of you in the audience tonight are, or you're attending with one, and you're here today to learn about safe practices for feeding from humans that protect brain health by learning about the human circulatory system. So by the end of the night tonight, you'll have learned about some of the core features of the human circulatory system in the brain and the jobs that blood has there. You'll learn about why you should protect the brain from blood loss, and you'll learn some easy ways to help ensure blood donor safety while still maintaining your nutritional needs. So first, let's start by discussing some common beliefs about vampires. So here's an easy one. You are all either vampires or friends and family of vampires, so you know that vampires don't burst into flames in sunlight, and they don't sparkle either. This is a good example of a myth that lots of people believe about vampires that's easily proven false. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Are vampires immortal? No, but they do have an extended lifespan compared to non-vampire humans. Vampire specialists believe that this difference is due to changes between vampires and humans' metabolic systems. So please check out the work of my colleague, Dr. Van Helsing, for more information about this topic. And finally, are vampires repelled by garlic? Turns out that about 1/3 of vampires are allergic to garlic to some degree. Some just can't eat garlicky foods, and some react to garlic in the air from a restaurant or a kitchen. But fortunately, garlic compounds don't enter the bloodstream after eating, so it's safe even for an allergic vampire to feed from people who have eaten garlic recently. Nobody knows why garlic allergy is linked to vampirism, but this is an active area of research. So now let's talk about some facts and fiction specifically related to vampire feeding practices. Are vampires sustained by human blood? Yes, vampires need about 5 liters a day of blood to meet their nutritional requirements, of which a minimum of 1 liter must be human. And mixing in animal blood for the rest of your intake is perfectly healthy, and in fact, you should be doing this. Does that blood need to be fresh? Partly true. The blood doesn't have to come directly from a donor on site in order to be fresh, but it does have to be fairly recent. Donated blood used in medicine can keep for up to about 35 days with proper preservation techniques, and it's about the same for blood used by vampires. It is a very common myth that blood must be drawn from the neck, and our whole point today is to understand why this is not a good idea. Blood from any artery will do for vampire purposes, and pretty much any other artery other than those in the neck is going to be safer. And we're going to spend the rest of the time tonight talking about why. It's also very common to believe that only very serious errors like draining a human completely dry will kill them. But we'll talk about how even small amounts of blood taken from the neck, or what might seem like moderate amounts of blood overall, can pose a serious danger. So you need to be aware of those dangers and what to do to avoid them. So first of all, what is blood? It's good for all of us to know what's in the food we eat. Blood is a complex mixture of many cellular and molecular components. The liquid part of blood is called plasma, and it's just water with nutrients dissolved in it, like sugars, such as glucose, which is the main energy source for the body, fats, proteins, and salts. And everything else is circulating in the plasma. Red blood cells represent 35 to 45% of the total blood volume. That's a little over a third to a little less than a half. And they're responsible for transporting oxygen around the body. Red blood cells survive for an average of just 120 days, about 4 months. That's one of the shortest lifespans of any cell type in the body. They turn over and they're replaced very regularly. That's why people can donate blood on a regular basis. White blood cells come in several different varieties, and together they represent only about 1% of your total blood volume. And they're involved in the immune response. This image here shows one white blood cell surrounded by a whole bunch of red blood cells. Platelets are part of the clotting response. When a blood vessel is damaged, platelets help form a lattice to repair the hole and coagulate blood into a gel to form a patch. Other circulating molecules in the blood include hormones, which are molecular signals that travel through the blood. Blood also carries away waste products as it circulates, such as urea, lactic acid, and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets breathed out, and the kidneys take care of the rest of the trash. Humans don't need to detox in any other way besides letting their kidneys do their job. There's also other circulating molecules and a lot more to know about blood, but this is the main set of things that you as vampires need to be concerned with. Remember also, all of the nutrients are found in arterial blood, which is blood traveling in arteries, which is blood that travels away from the heart, and all of the waste products are found in venous blood, traveling in veins back towards the heart. This will be important later. Your nutritional needs also include some versions of these cells and molecules that are specific to human blood, not animals. So at least some of your blood must come from human sources. Food scientists are working hard on the equivalent of impossible beef, but in the meantime, you must rely on real human blood. Blood has a lot of jobs in the body that you should be aware of before you just go start draining it out of people. So the job that everybody knows about blood is that it carries oxygen throughout the body. Specifically, inside of those red blood cells, hemoglobin molecules, which is what you're looking at here at the top left, bind oxygen, which is then delivered around the body as the blood circulates. Deoxygenated hemoglobin then circulates back to the heart to be refilled with oxygen in the lungs. Carbon dioxide also gets dissolved in blood as it circulates through the body and then circulated back to the lungs where you breathe it out. Other things that are also found in the blood, as we covered, white blood cells, platelets, hormones, unprocessed nutrients from the stomach and the intestines travel through the blood to the liver, where they get processed into nutrients that your cells can use. And then those nutrients go back into the blood to get circulated around the body as glucose and amino acids. And finally, that waste gets carried away, and it also drains out through the lymphatic system. So arterial blood has all those nutrients. Venous blood has all the waste. So vampires specifically need arterial blood. Blood donors for medical blood banks give venous blood because the recipients aren't dependent on the nutrients, where vampires are. Blood is part of the cardiovascular system, which also includes the heart and the blood vessels. The lungs are not part of the cardiovascular system. They're the pulmonary system, but they're closely related. That's where the oxygen enters the bloodstream. An adult human body contains about 5 liters of blood on average, which is, depending on a person's total average or total size, which is about 7% of their total body weight. Coincidentally, 5 liters is also the amount of blood that a vampire needs in a day. But obviously, an ethical vampire like you would not take that all from one person. So this is a quick overview of some of the most critical functions of blood relevant to vampire interest, and it's not comprehensive. And today, we're going to be focusing on the brain. So what does blood do in the brain specifically? As it does in the rest of the body, blood brings oxygen to the brain, and nutrients, and also materials for building neurotransmitters, which are the chemical signals that neurons, brain cells, use to talk to each other. The difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone is just that neurotransmitters are where neurons talk to each other or where they're talking to muscles directly, and hormones are circulating in the blood. Neurotransmitters in the brain are then made from these parts and then directly in the brain cell that they're going to be released from. And neurons also have to do all the regular jobs that any other cell in the body has to do. The brain uses an estimated 20% of oxygen and calories, which remains pretty steady even when a person isn't doing anything particular or is asleep. So it's not safer to feed from a person, safer for their brain health, if they're sleeping. So the image you're looking at here on the left is a functional MRI, which measures the fraction of hemoglobin, that molecule in red blood cells that carries the oxygen, that has oxygen in it or not. This can be used as a proxy for how active the neurons, the brain cells in that part of the brain are, which lets us estimate how active that area of the brain is. So this particular fMRI, functional MRI, shows an image of the brain looking from the top down with the face at the top of the image. And we're looking at a slice taken around the level of the eyes, which is where that orange bar is on the diagram on the right. In this image, there's increased brain activity in the visual cortex near the back of the brain in response to this person viewing an image. The brain is especially sensitive to interruptions in blood flow compared to the rest of the body, which is why vampires need to be aware of the role of blood in the brain specifically and what kind of damage those interruptions can cause. The chemical and electrical properties of the brain require a lot of active maintenance. The energy source for that maintenance is ATP, and the brain needs oxygen to make ATP from glucose. This process starts to be affected after just 2 minutes, or after just 30 seconds of lacking oxygen, and then it stops completely after only 2 minutes. And then the neurons start to die in just 5 minutes. Even if oxygen is restored, some of those cells may be set on an irreversible path to death. In contrast to the brain, the kidney and the liver can survive for 15 to 20 minutes without oxygen. Skeletal muscles, that's the muscles in your body that you can voluntarily move, can survive for 60 to 90 minutes. And bladder and blood vessel wall muscles can survive for up to 3 days without oxygen. And in all of these cases, these cells are turning over regularly and are being replaced, whereas the ability to grow new neurons is limited to none, depending on what stage of life a person is in and what part of the brain we're talking about. Even if a person could grow new neurons, they wouldn't have the connections that the old ones did. So the connections that, or the memories and the skills that used those connections would remain gone. So all of this adds up to that vampires need to be careful about making sure that the humans who are feeding them so generously make sure they're getting enough blood in their brains. So the next question to ask is, how does blood get to the brain? So blood gets to the brain via the neck, which doesn't surprise anyone. It's the only pathway there. The stereotypical location for vampires to draw blood is also from the neck. We've all seen it on TV, but it's wrong. Many vampires believe that this is the best way to eat because they've seen it so many times in TV or movies from writers who did not do their research. But this is extremely dangerous. Just 2 pairs of arteries provide the entire blood supply to the brain. The vertebral arteries travel in part inside of the spinal cord, inside of the spine, next to the spinal cord, one each on the left and the right sides of the vertebrae. The single common carotid artery, which starts down lower here on the neck, then splits into the internal and external carotid arteries. This is the second pathway. The carotids are not inside of the spine. This is the artery that a vampire could reach. The internal carotid arteries then supply the brain, and the external carotid arteries supply the face and the neck itself. The blood flow of the internal carotid arteries, the artery that a vampire can reach, is about 6 times larger than the blood flow in the vertebral arteries. So just these 2 pairs of arteries are supplying all the blood to the brain. The vertebral arteries are inside of the spine. So that would mean if a vampire is drinking from the neck, it would be from the common carotid if down lower, or the internal or external if up higher. And that would be disrupting a larger fraction of the blood that is getting to the brain because that artery is bigger. Even though the nose is right there next to the brain, there is no flow of oxygen from the nose to the brain directly. It all goes from the nose and the mouth to the lungs, and then from the lungs into the bloodstream. As we've talked about, you as vampires are only really interested in veins in order to avoid them. But just so you know, the main drainage for the face, head, and brain are all the jugular veins. So once the blood reaches the brain, it needs to circulate within the brain. So this is what happens after the blood reaches the brain, and we're going to keep talking about why it's dangerous to take blood from the neck. So I want you to understand what happens within the brain once the blood has successfully gotten there. In this diagram, we're again looking down through the top of the head with the face at the top of the image. It's the same orientation as that MRI we looked at a minute ago. And we're only looking at arteries in this image. There's no veins here. The internal carotid and the vertebral arteries that we just talked about coming through the neck are circled in pink. They feed the 3 primary cerebral arteries, which then distribute blood throughout the brain. Cerebral just means that they're in the brain, and there is the anterior, the middle, and the posterior, very creatively named. The uncircled arteries, while they're obviously important to the brain health, are just smaller. They're just not as important here. The vertebral arteries mainly supply the posterior cerebral arteries, which deliver blood to the back part of the brain. And the internal carotid arteries mainly supply the anterior and middle cerebral arteries, which supply the rest of the brain. You can see the approximate areas mainly supplied by each of these cerebral arteries here. So you can see that the areas that are mainly supplied by the anterior and middle cerebral arteries from the internal carotid are much larger than the area supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, which primarily gets blood from the vertebral artery. So you may have noticed something very funny when you're looking at this diagram, which is that these blood vessels form a circle. This is called the circle of Willis. Nobody knows the evolutionary origin of the circle of Willis, but it has 2 big benefits. One is that the blood being pushed through the arteries has big variations in the pressure in between heartbeats. It's like being in the wave pool at a water park, except the entire wave pool is contained in a tube slide. So the circle of Willis points these pulses of fluid at each other, which helps smooth it out, so then your head isn't pounding with every single heartbeat. The other big benefit is that if there is a blockage in one of the arteries to or within the brain, the circle of Willis can help redistribute the blood from the remaining arteries to circulate throughout the brain. However, you should not take this as permission to reduce the blood flow from one of the arteries in the neck on purpose. This redundancy can help save a person's life in an emergency, but it still puts someone at unnecessary risk to do it on purpose. So, now that you understand where all the blood is going and what it's doing in the brain, I'm going to touch on some specific dangers caused by interruptions to blood flow, whether or not they're caused by vampires. So the consequences of losing blood flow or its precious oxygen to the brain, even briefly, are serious, which can be caused by either not enough blood reaching the brain or that the blood that does reach the brain doesn't have enough oxygen in it. One of the most common ways that this happens is in a stroke, which can happen in two ways. An ischemic stroke is caused by an interruption of blood flow in one of the arteries to or within the brain. About 87% of strokes are ischemic. One of the main causes of an ischemic stroke is a blood clot that blocks the flow of blood to or within the brain. That's what's happening in, I can't point. I don't know where my cursor is. That's what's happening in this diagram on the left, is that we have a clot that is floating in the artery. It floats along to the brain, and then it gets stuck like a cork in a smaller blood vessel. So then the blood cannot get past it. Losing too much blood, whether from an injury or, say, a sloppy vampire, or a sudden loss of circulation, such as in a heart attack, can also cause ischemic strokes. If you take away all the blood, there will naturally also be an impairment in blood flow to the brain, which is to say also that a vampire can cause a stroke if they're not careful. How much blood is safe to lose without causing a stroke? When donating blood for medical purposes, the donation is typically 500 milliliters, which is a little bit over a pint, and about 10% of the donor's total blood volume of about 5 liters. Most people notice only minimal effects when losing up to 15% of their blood volume, like some lightheadedness. At a blood loss of about 20%, a person can start experiencing symptoms of shock, which is a systemic lack of blood flow, while stroke is a lack of blood flow specifically to the brain. A person in shock is going to start to have more significant symptoms like severe lightheadedness, nausea, and even anxiety from that lack of blood pressure. At about 30%, we're getting into serious danger territory, and a person will be extremely disoriented or even pass out. At 40%, due to the lack of blood pressure, organ failure starts, and at 50%, the ability to pump blood at all collapses. The other main type of stroke, which you're not as likely to encounter as they're generally rarer and also vampires can't accidentally cause them, are hemorrhagic strokes. This is when a blood vessel bursts in the brain and it releases uncontained blood into the brain. Other incidents that cause a loss of blood or oxygen to the brain that wouldn't be caused by a vampire include head trauma and interruptions to breathing that mean that even if blood is continuing to circulate, it doesn't have enough oxygen in it. So the main risk among these cerebrovascular events that you can cause is an ischemic stroke by impairing blood flow to the brain, which may be from just removing too much blood from circulation, or it may be from removing a smaller volume of blood, specifically from the neck. Again, just those two pairs of arteries are supplying the whole blood supply to the brain, and that if you are interrupting that blood supply in the neck, then we are interrupting the blood supply to the brain. So it follows that vampires should never feed from the neck due to the high fraction of the blood supply to the brain that's being interrupted. It's just not worth that risk. It's also important for responsible vampires like you to know the signs and symptoms of stroke, because you'll all be responsible enough to not cause one in a human, but strokes happen all the time without vampires, and you should be prepared. So use the acronym FAST to remember what to do. F is for face. Ask them to smile. Does one side droop? A is for arms. Ask them to raise their arms if does one of them slump down. S is for speech. Ask them to say something. Does it sound slurred or strange? And T is for time. Call 911 immediately. Strokes are treatable if you act quickly. So FAST, face, arms, speech, time. What happens if a stroke or other cerebrovascular event isn't caught quickly? What kind of damage can it cause? The average amount of lost brain tissue after an ischemic stroke is 54 milliliters, which is about a quarter cup or a little bit bigger than a golf ball. For each minute that a stroke goes untreated, an average of 1.9 million neurons are permanently damaged or killed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it does add up fast. This happens whether it's a natural stroke or caused by a vampire. Which artery is affected by a stroke will lead to the size of the stroke, what brain regions are affected, and therefore the effects on a person's brain function and their likelihood of surviving. So in these images, you're looking at what has happened to a brain after this person has had a stroke. So these two images are two different types of MRI of the same person who had a stroke that wasn't caused by a vampire, but the same types of observations would apply. In both of these, you're looking at the brain, again, from the top down with the face at the top, like the other images we looked at earlier. And these images are mirrored left to right, which is the typical in radiology. This person had a stroke in their left middle cerebral artery, which is pointed out by the arrow on the left image. There's a little bright spot that shows where that clot occurred. And in the right image, we can see the effects of the reduced blood flow in those bright and blurrier areas on the right side of the image, which is the left side of this person's brain. And that these are in the person's temporal, parietal, and occipital cortex. So you can see that there's a chunk near the middle on the right side, and then there's another smaller chunk near the back of the brain. So this person and it also affected their caudate nucleus as well, in addition to those three cortical areas. So this person may have some memory symptoms, some issues with processing information from their senses, especially vision, and they may have some difficulty with movement, especially because it was the left side of their brain on the right side of their body. About 25% of strokes are fatal within 30 days, and 40% are fatal within 1 year. So a preventable stroke from a risky or greedy vampire feeding technique is a poor way to thank the people who are voluntarily feeding you. Fresh, clinically drawn blood from a vampire blood bank meets all your nutritional needs without running this risk. So I've reviewed some basic principles of the human cardiovascular system, and you've learned how to understand these dangers in their anatomical context. So here's some tips for safer blood collection that lets you, the vampire, meet your nutritional needs while also maintaining the highest safety standards for your donors. So don't just draw blood from any blood vessel. You need arterial blood. Though it won't be oxygenated anymore if you don't drink it immediately, it still has the nutrients that you actually need and none of the waste products. You know this one now. Say it with me. Can you drink from the neck? No. You should really be working with a blood bank, but if you find yourself needing to feed from someone independently, never, ever draw blood from the neck. Even though there's those two arteries on each side of the neck that carry the blood to the brain, and thanks to the circle of Willis, the blood gets redistributed within the brain, the feeding from the neck just poses an unacceptably high risk of interruptions to the brain's blood supply. So work instead with a vampire blood bank, who will draw fresh blood from an artery in a person's arm. From a donor's perspective, this is very similar to any other modern blood draw, except that they're giving arterial blood instead of venous blood. Because blood can keep for about a month, you can then pick up batches at your convenience. And working in a clinical setting also helps maintain proper sanitation and obtain proper informed consent. How much blood can you get per person? It's safe to draw up to about 500 milliliters per day per donor. So to gather the minimum of 1 liter of human blood that you need per day, you would need blood from 2 people. But the same donor should not give blood more than once every 8 to 12 weeks. And remember that the other 4 liters can and should be animal blood. And even with the best safety practices, don't assume that donors are completely safe. Learn the signs and symptoms of stroke and how to respond to them. If a person giving blood for you independently or just a person in your life starts to show these symptoms of having a stroke, call 911 immediately. EMTs are trained in how to support people who are having a stroke and can help ensure their best possible outcome. Friends and family of vampires, please support the vampire in your life by signing up to donate blood. For vampire blood donations, please contact Vampires Puget Sound for information. If you don't have access to a Vampires Puget Sound blood donation site and you're eligible to donate, please consider giving to a regular blood bank for non-vampire human medical use. The Pacific Northwest is especially in need of type O donors and platelet donors of any blood type right now. Your donation could literally save a life. I donated blood today. It took 20 minutes. It's so easy. So check with your work or school about blood drives or make an appointment at BloodWorks Northwest to go to one of their locations. And you can learn more about eligibility on their website. So to summarize the science you've learned that motivates these responsible blood collection procedures. Blood has many jobs in the body, and as we've covered today, a constant supply to the brain is especially critical. And compounding that, blood flow to the brain depends on just a few arterial pathways. But the circulation within the brain is robust and interconnected. And the consequences of interruptions to blood flow in the brain are serious and can be fatal. So be sure that you know the signs of stroke. So thank you to all the vampires and their non-vampire friends and family for joining us today. And I hope you're leaving tonight with an improved understanding of some techniques for meeting your nutritional needs as a vampire and a deeper understanding of the science behind them. And now, questions. Yes? Yeah, so the question for those online was, what is the closest animal blood to humans, and would we collect from their necks? So the process of why we know which animal's blood is most similar to human blood is because in the heroic age of medicine, which is when they just tried anything to see what would work, that they tried doing something called xenotransfusion, so transfusing blood from another animal into a human. And sometimes it worked. And that it turns out that the two species that the blood works best for xenotransfusion, which is how we then figure out that those are the best for vampires, are from lambs and pigs. And in particular, pig red blood cells are very similar to humans, and their blood types are very similar to the human A, B, and O blood groups. So it may actually be possible in the long run to genetically modify pigs to produce blood that's even closer to human than it already is. And also pig blood viscosity is very similar to humans, which is really useful scientifically for being able to study blood that is very similar to humans. But surprisingly, the pig hearts are also similar to human hearts. And surprisingly, ape and monkey blood is actually not necessarily a better candidate. It's not necessarily closer than human blood, and it's also pig. There's so many pigs. There's just like so many pigs. So it's really easy to get a hold of pig blood. I looked into this in advance of tonight because I was wondering that I would get this question. And I also wondered what animals have blood that is very, very dissimilar to humans and would potentially not be a great candidate for a vampire to drink from. And that camels have, I kind of glossed over this today. Humans and almost all other species, red blood cells, are the only cells in the body that do not have a nucleus. The nucleus is where in the cell all of the DNA is found. Red blood cells don't have this, except in camels. No one's totally sure why, but I would not recommend that a vampire try to drink from a camel. Also, camels are a lot to handle, so it is not advisable for multiple reasons. Yeah, and then as far as where would you get the blood from in a pig, for example, it depends on whether the pig is going to remain around after this process. There's a lot of pigs especially in the United States, because they are used for pork production. So if we are collecting the blood from the pig as part of it entering the pork stream of products, then we can draw it from the neck because we are not worried about that pig's survival. But if we want the pig to survive, then no, we shouldn't draw it from the neck. Yes?
I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but I was curious about how since vampires use only primarily particular arterial blood, but it's not like a lot more pressure.
It is.
So I guess what are the best tactics for vampires to take arterial blood without evoking the arterial?
So the question, for those who couldn't hear it and online, was that the arteries have much higher blood pressure than the veins because that's where the blood is being pumped through the body. So in order for a vampire who is taking a clinical donation or a field donation of blood, what is the best technique in order to avoid blood pressure effects? And that in the clinical setting, I am not a clinician. I have a PhD. I am not the helpful kind of doctor in this scenario. I will leave that to those experts. But in a field scenario, I would suggest maybe just getting a nice good seal on the site. Yes? Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So the first part of the question was, is the layout of blood vessels to and within the brain the same in every person? And the answer to that is yes. In every healthy individual who developed typically, the distribution of those major blood vessels is going to look basically the same. When you get down to the little capillaries, then there's more individual variation. Some people do have congenital differences in those blood vessels, and what impact that's going to have is going to depend on the nature of that. Does the blood flow, the second part of the question was like, does the blood flow distribution have any impact on like cognitive function? Is that right? Does the pattern of blood flow and blood distribution have impact on what diseases we might have? It would potentially lead to sort of a cerebrovascular injury, like a stroke, but that it doesn't necessarily have like reduced blood flow leading to like the development of Alzheimer's, for example. Yeah. Yes. That's a great question. So the question was, are there effects on the immune system? Is there like a vitamin C kind of an effect? Which actually vitamin C doesn't really help your immune system, for what it's worth. That does drinking the blood that has those white blood cells in it help your immune system? No, because those get digested in the stomach, and then they don't actually enter the vampire's bloodstream. Yeah. Did it? Yes. What is artificial blood and how does that use? That's a great question. I know that there's a lot of research into how do we develop artificial blood products, but that is not at all my area of expertise. I cannot speak to how it is used in a clinical setting. For vampire use, it is still under development. Yes? Is it ethical or non-ethical to feed from a person who is having their period? Are we talking about regular feeding or? Yeah. Well, so period blood is not arterial blood, so that's not really helpful here. It doesn't have the nutrients in it. As we talked about, the oxygenation status of the blood is not really relevant to a vampire, but the nutrient status is. So that doesn't really help. If a person is already losing some of their blood, if they say have a really heavy period, then maybe feeding from them or having them donate blood during that time may not be the best choice. But for people who don't experience that, then it should be fine. Yes? That's a great question. Also, one more point about blood donation during periods. If you are donating blood for medical use, they don't stop you from donating during your period. Yeah. Can a vampire, can a human transmit diseases to a vampire by feeding from them? Not that I'm aware of, because the blood is then going to enter the vampire's stomach where it would be digested. So any of those pathogens should be broken down before they would enter the vampire's bloodstream. Yes?
As a non-vampire, I've always been curious, is there a particular blood type that is tastiest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the three main blood types that are in humans are A, B, and O. They don't stand for anything, and that the way that this works is that there's antigens, which is a type of protein, that are found on the surface of red blood cells. There's two types, A and B. If you have type A blood, you have type A antigens. If you have type B blood, you have type B. If you have type O blood, you have neither of them. And if you have type AB blood, you have both of them. And then those antigens are paired with opposite antibodies. So a person who has type A blood has antigens or antibodies against the type B antigen, which is why in a medical blood donation context, a person who has type A blood cannot receive a donation of type B. It's also why type O blood is so valuable to be donated, because it can be given to anybody. Kind of, because then there's a second set of how we classify blood types, which is plus and minus. So if you have like type O positive blood, you don't have the A and B antigens, but you do have the rhesus, which is called that because it was first identified in rhesus monkeys. And it's that one's that you have it or you don't. So that's where the plus and minus comes from. It's actually called rhesus D. There's other rhesus proteins as well, but rhesus D is the most common one that we have to worry about. So there's dozens of other antibodies and antigens and corresponding antibodies that can cause a reaction if a person receives a blood transfusion that doesn't match, but the others are significantly more rare, so it just doesn't come up that often. But for a vampire, because it's all going into the stomach, it does not matter in the slightest. Yes?
So, is there like a theory on, like evolutionary theory on why we have different blood types? Like, why don't all humans have the same blood?
That's a great question. I have no idea. Yeah, here and then here. The neck is definite. So the question is, the neck veins are bad. Are there other veins that are also bad? So I would say the neck is by far the worst vein or arteries to deal with, because the brain is so sensitive to that loss of blood flow. Other arteries that I would keep an eye on are smaller ones, especially in like the arms and legs where you don't have a lot of branching. So like, I don't actually know what it's called, but there's an artery in the upper arm that's a bigger one. So I would watch out for that. I would also maybe not feed from the aorta, which is a really big blood vessel, but that's actually a vein. But that I would just try to maybe favor smaller arteries. Yeah, less likely to overdo it. Yes?
For those who are supporting the vampires around us,
Yes.
as long as we're doing it responsibly on the timeline and amounts, any pros, cons of being a vampire supporter?
Any pros or cons of being a vampire supporter in the literal sense of donating blood? Most people are eligible to donate blood. I would encourage you to go check out Bloodworks Northwest's website to find out specific eligibility criteria. But then if you are eligible and it doesn't, from your personal experience, lead to any negative health effects, some people, for example, faint if they give blood. And honestly, some people are just afraid of needles, and I respect that. But if none of those things apply to you, there's really no downside. Yeah. Yes? What are the similarities and differences between the brain of a human and the brain of a vampire? Oh, that's a great question. Okay, well, I think actually this is probably a great moment for me to say vampires aren't real. All of the science that I've told you about is real, and all of the vampire stuff that I've told you about is based in common vampire mythology and folktale and fiction and Twilight, but obviously there's not vampires. But the idea of a vampire is that they are like a human, but they're dependent on blood for their nutrients. They're often faster and stronger in depictions of vampires. They often have longer lifespan. I went down this whole rabbit hole while I was preparing for this of figuring out the metabolic requirements of vampires. And that given that vampires turn from humans, I would expect a vampire brain and a human brain to be very similar. The main things that I would expect potentially to be different are probably around circadian rhythm. Vampires don't burn up in sunlight, but they do favor the night in most depictions. And depending on what type of vampire we're dealing with, sometimes you see depictions of vampires that are kind of amoral. So I would potentially expect to see some changes in like the prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for complex thoughts and personality and decision making. Yeah. Yes? Can humans survive off of human blood? That's a great question. Well, so no one would have done that study for obvious reasons. But in my preparation for this, I did discover that blood has about 700 calories per liter. And humans can safely eat blood from other species. So pivoting to other species, for example, blood pudding is literally made from blood, and that people can eat that perfectly well. I don't think it has all of the amino acids that you necessarily need and necessarily in the right balances. So if a person was going to try to live on blood pudding, which I believe is made from pig blood, they would probably want a multivitamin. Yeah. Any questions online? Yes. No, that's good. Oh, what was the most interesting or unique thing I learned while preparing? I think probably the camel blood was probably my favorite. Just that, that's one of the bio 101 things that we learn when we're learning about cell types in the body is that red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They don't have DNA in them. And then camels do for some reason. And that I didn't really get a satisfactory answer as to why camels have nucleated red blood cells, and I just thought that was fascinating. There's not a lot of funding in camel hematology research. So there was not anything that I could find that described the changes to blood function in camels as a result of them having nuclei in their red blood cells. Yes. Well, so the thing with apes and monkeys is largely that there's not as many of them, and that by standards of sort of animal use in research and in the agricultural industry, that there have higher levels of protection than pigs, for example. So it's more of a supply concern. And pigs are already a really close substitute for human blood. They're very similar. Yeah.
But now out of curiosity for the science.
Yeah.
So these chimpanzee blood close to human blood?
I wasn't able to find a ton of information about that. I did look into it. Just because chimpanzees are quite closely related to humans and gorillas, and actually bonobos are probably the great ape that is most closely related to humans, but that just because they are very similar to us genetically, that doesn't mean that the expression of how those genes turn into the parts of their bodies are identical. So I wasn't able to find a ton of information, and I don't have a great answer for you on that. No. Yes?
I saw a video on the internet, and it must be true, about a device that's being used in some emergency departments where you can kind of see through skin to see veins and
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
and I saw one video about it, and then I didn't see it again. So I'm just wondering if you know that or the applications.
So the question was about devices being used in clinical settings that can help clinicians visualize blood vessels more clearly. No, that isn't an area of expertise for me. I don't even know first aid, man. I do not have clinical expertise to contribute. Yes.
I feel like one of the biggest reasons the vampires go for the carotid artery is it's the easiest to get to. It's right there.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I give blood, they go for my arm, but sometimes they gotta stick me a few times.
Yeah, I actually failed my last blood donation because they couldn't get a good stick on me. I got it today though.
How would a vampire go about they're not gonna let you shine a light on your arm?
Yeah.
Tie a tourniquet so they can find the right vein before they fight you, right?
Yeah.
How would an ethical vampire go about surprise drinking from a vein, or what vein?
Well, if the vampire is really being ethical, they wouldn't drink from a person by surprise because they will have gotten proper informed consent before they get started. So then they would be able to say, hey, can I put a tourniquet on here and then, just check it out like they do when you're giving blood in a clinical setting. Yes, I think that the reason people go for the carotid or the jugular, sort of in terms of the manner of speech, is because it's really easy to access, and also if you are an unethical vampire and you don't care if you kill a person, that's pretty straightforward to get to. But that if you care, you're not trying to jump somebody anyway.
So I guess the question was though, really, what are some of the more accessible, safer arts?
That's a great question. I'm a neuroscientist, so my expertise is here. I'm not even really, as well versed in the peripheral nervous system, the parts that are in the body, as much as in the brain and in the spinal cord. So, yes, here and then here. What is the spookiest fact I can tell you about the brain? Whew, that's an interesting question. I like it. I'm going to have to think about that one. Maybe something about like how easy it is for things to go poorly in the brain. That's a little dark. Oh, the effects of ergot. That's a great suggestion. Yeah, so ergot, for those who are not familiar, is a fungus that commonly grows on wheat and other grains, and it can cause hallucinations. Some people believe it may have contributed to the Salem witch panic, but I am only 225 pages into my book that is 400 pages long about the Salem witch trials, so ask me in a week. Yes, here and then there and then Callie.
Encouraging vampires to pursue phlebotomy?
Are there outreach programs encouraging vampires to pursue phlebotomy? If vampires were real, I would totally suggest that they go into phlebotomy and hematology and clinical laboratory medicine. They'd be so I am fixated on learning all of this. I do think that would be a pretty great profession for a medically oriented vampire. Yes.
So you talked a lot about brain and how much blood is in there. Are zombies a little bit vampires because they're go after so much concentration of blood?
So are zombies like vampires because they're going for a high concentration of blood? Well, briefly, I will say, maybe come back next October to learn more about zombies. But also that zombies are specifically interested in the brain tissue, not so much in the blood that is in the brain.
So the tissue isn't permeated with blood?
It is, but that they're interested in the brain cells as opposed to the blood that's in it. The blood is a tasty byproduct for a zombie.
Maybe it would be nice to have an alliance with a zombie. They filter out, they don't need blood anyway.
Yeah, team up between a vampire and a zombie. They're unstoppable. Yeah. Yeah, unstoppable and undead. Yeah.
Someone asked a question earlier about if there was any dangers for vampires from eating human blood, but for the human donors, are there any risks if a vampire didn't brush their teeth? Is that
So the question, if you couldn't hear it, and for those online, is, are the humans at risk if a vampire doesn't brush their teeth? So there are plenty of diseases that are transmitted by fluid-to-fluid contact. So if we are assuming that a vampire is close enough to a human that they could have some of these diseases, which I think we can reasonably, in this mythology that I made up personally completely by myself, assume that, yes, I think that we could potentially be worried about that. And the reason we're not worried about it for a human transmitting the diseases to a vampire so much is that it's going to go into the stomach where those things would be destroyed. So depending on the disease, you could also have absorption in the mouth potentially, but that's not my area of expertise. Yeah.
Was the main reason that you recommended vampires get most of their blood from animals because of
was the main reason I recommended that vampires get most of their blood from animals is because of a human blood donor shortage. Well, not really. The story here is that we want to be responsible and only use the minimal amount of human blood that we can get away with. And also that would mean that more of the human donors who are willing to give blood, that blood can get diverted to medical use instead of to vampire use. Because there's only so many people who are willing and able to donate. And also, they can only donate every 8 to 12 weeks. Yes? Like artificial blood? Yeah, the question was, what is the state of research on artificial blood? And that's a great question that I will Google when I go home. Yes? Does the surface area of the brain change with time? That's a great question. So, from when you are born to when you become an adult, the brain does get larger. And that does mean it has more surface area. And do I have a good picture of the outside of a brain in here? I don't think I do. So the outside of the brain is kind of wrinkly, and that is in order to help increase the surface area of specifically cortex, which is the wrinkly bits on the outside of the brain, because that type of brain tissue always has 6 layers of brain cells, neurons, that are stacked on top of each other. They're not precisely defined like it's biology. There's no straight lines in biology. But that in order to then have more of that cortex inside of the brain, it's wrinkly, like if you can imagine like taking a flat piece of paper and putting it inside of a ball versus a squinched up piece of paper and putting it inside, that you're going to get more surface area out of it. So as you grow, the total volume of the brain increases as well as the surface area. And then as people age, that there is, even in healthy aging, some reduction in brain volume over time. And that is potentially going to affect the cortex as well. But it's not like the brain loses its wrinkles with age. Those are actually, all of those wrinkles are in exactly the same place in every healthy, typically developing person. Yeah. Yeah, if there are anatomical changes to the brain, say there's a brain injury or a stroke, that would ultimately lead to some of those blood vessels potentially being rerouted to like go around the damage. And also that the blood flow would just change, like if an artery was interrupted, it's like if the bridge is down, then the blood will just follow a different route. Yeah. Yes, a question online.
More of a comment. Abby noted that there are thoughts on
Hi, Abby.
possible rabbit vampires, like cross-contamination. Speaking of the saliva transmission of illnesses.
Yeah, concerned about vampires with rabies and having salivary transmission. That would be one of the diseases that I would be really worried about a vampire potentially transmitting to a human, because it does transmit through a bite specifically. And that rabies is really, really bad. So if a vampire has rabies, we would want to be we would want to get them into treatment immediately. Rabies is really, if you catch it early on in the progression, it is treatable, but the farther it gets, the less treatable it is, to the point where in end-stage rabies, I believe 1 person ever has survived. Yeah.
So I have questions about the amygdala between a human and a vampire.
Yeah.
So what differences do you think that a vampire would have as opposed to human for that region? And also, the part of the brain that sort of processes sort of basic sort of functions of the brainstem.
Yeah.
How do you think that would change between a human and a vampire?
So the question was, what differences do I think there would be in the amygdala and also in the brainstem between a human and a vampire? So again, remembering that I have made all of this vampire stuff up, I think that there probably wouldn't be a lot of difference between the amygdala of a human and a vampire. It's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that the amygdala is responsible for fear. It's more about like aversive stimuli, but that vampires can be scared by things just like any human can, and that they have to assess and manage risks potentially even more than a human would. So I wouldn't really expect a lot of differences there. In terms of not just the brainstem, but specifically the subcortical regions, which is all the stuff that is not cortex, I would probably expect some differences, mainly around circadian rhythm in vampires. And yeah, I think that would be the main difference I would expect, because if we're assuming that vampires favor the night, that human circadian rhythm is programmed. There's actually a special type of light receiving cell in the eye that doesn't help you see, that these light receptors just help you know what time of day it is. And that those help feed your circadian rhythm. And it's like, okay, it's getting dark out, it's time to go to bed. Okay, it's getting light out, okay, it's time to be awake. And that light receptor helps you maintain that clock. That's one of the reasons that it's recommended to avoid blue light before bed, because that's like bright daylight signal to that part of the brain. But for a vampire, receiving those signals, it's like, oh, it's getting dark out, time to wake up. So it's just, some humans actually have this, that their natural sleep cycle is significantly offset from the average. So that's what I would expect to see in a vampire. Yeah? Can we incubate a brain and keep it alive? Like in a jar? I wouldn't recommend that we do that. It would be, I would consider it an unethical experiment to have a brain in a jar that's not receiving any like stimuli or an ability to move. But as it stands, also, we can't currently keep a brain alive outside of a body. We don't have the ability to pump the blood through it properly, to provide the nutrients to it properly. That's just not, like, that's why brain injuries are so important to treat quickly, because we don't really have the technology to even help, like, when it's inside of somebody's skull sometimes. Yeah. Yes? Ultimately, yes. Yeah. So the question is, so we have neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that neurons use to talk to each other, and that the neurotransmitters are made from nutrients, which ultimately come from the food we eat. Therefore, does the food we eat, have any impact on the way we think? So not really, because we're breaking down the food that we eat into its really molecular level components. So as long as a person's diet has enough of a balance that they're getting all of the amino acids and all of the sugars that they need, then by the time that it's getting to the brain, it's all just the same molecules. Like a glucose molecule that came from a nice fresh piece of fruit and a glucose molecule that came from a Pop-Tart are indistinguishable to the brain. And that, now that said, if you eat foods that are, fresh and healthy and whole, that it can have effects on your mood if you're eating foods that you enjoy eating and that have, freshness to them. But that is really a psychological situation, not on the level of the molecules. Yeah.
Any final questions before you all head out for your next feeding?
Yeah. What do I recommend? What? Oh, like what food do I recommend to prevent Alzheimer's? That's a great question, and that's a really common one that people ask, like, what can I eat? What brain games can I do? What can I do to help protect myself against Alzheimer's? And we don't really have a great understanding yet of what causes Alzheimer's on a cellular level, what causes Alzheimer's in terms of our habits, and that still is a huge area of research. In general, people who keep more physically and mentally active overall have less cognitive decline as they age. Everyone has some cognitive decline as they age, and that is totally normal and healthy. But that remaining physically and mentally active can help with, basically use it or lose it kind of functions. But then as far as, are there foods that help prevent Alzheimer's? Not that I know of. I don't think that the research on that is particularly definitive, but I'm not an expert there. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. This is my first really big one back in person since COVID, and I'm so glad that you were all here with me. Thank you.
Dr. Caitlin Casimo, thank you so much for being here. Thank all of you for being here and your amazing questions tonight. To engage more with Pacific Science Center, come back tomorrow. We have a Science After Dark. It's a 21+ Halloween-themed event taking place tomorrow. We have a lot of other events on our webpage. Keep an eye on that events page for our next upcoming dates for our science and a movie functions, which are also great opportunities to engage with a STEM expert. I hope you all have an excellent night. May all your vampire interactions be ethical. And once again, thank you so much. When you're ready to exit please over to your left, down the stairs and out those far doors. Thank you all for coming and have a great evening.